Hello everyone, and welcome back. Imagine waking up in a world where every safety feature you depend on railings, helmets, warning signs, even the idea of a locked door does not exist yet. That was the Middle Ages. Life then was not organized around prevention but reaction. People did not build to protect themselves. They built to impress, to conquer, or to prey. Only when things went horribly wrong did they stop and think, maybe we should fix that. It is strange to picture, but almost every medieval improvement came with a story of pain behind it: a burned hall, a drowned noble, a broken neck, a thunderstruck bell ringer. Safety was not a plan. It was an apology to the dead. To understand how this world worked, you have to imagine a time before caution tape or common sense. Castles were built tall and majestic, with moats full of waste circling their stone walls. These moats looked impressive until you realized they killed more servants than enemies. People fell in because there were no barriers, no torches bright enough to show where solid ground ended and sludge began. Servants fetching water at dusk slipped, knights returning from a feast stumbled, and children playing too close vanished in seconds. The morning would bring discovery, mourning, and then one small adjustment, a rope, a railing, or a simple rule. Progress. Medieval style was written in the language of aftermath. That same pattern repeated everywhere. A candle tips over in a monastery, burning centuries of work, so someone invents the metal candle guard. A bell ringer dies during a storm, so a new rule forbids ringing when lightning strikes. A worker falls from scaffolding, so a low wall appears around the next one. They were not designing for safety. They were just trying not to repeat the same nightmare twice. It was survival by memory. People did not talk about hazards or risk assessment. They talked about misfortune, fate, and divine punishment. But even they started to notice a pattern. Misfortune often looked suspiciously like bad design. This reactive mindset ran deep into daily life. Imagine living in a stone house with an open hearth burning all day. One careless spark, and everything goes up in flames. That happened often. Entire streets burned because of a single cooking accident. At first, people blamed the devil, or God, or ill luck. But after enough disasters, they quietly began to change their habits. Kitchens were built in separate wings, far from the sleeping chambers. Floors were covered in sand instead of straw. Buckets of water were left nearby, not because they expected a fire, but because they had already buried neighbors who had not. Even the smallest inventions tell the same story. Take the toilet lid. Medieval toilets' garderobes were holes in wooden planks above deep shafts. They were simple, quick, and deadly. The wood rotted, the holes widened, and occasionally someone important fell straight through. It sounds like a dark joke, but it is true. Nobles, servants, and even soldiers met their end that way. Eventually, someone decided to cover the hole with a wooden lid when not in use. Not for hygiene, not for dignity, just to stop people falling into the castle's waste system. That small improvement would echo through centuries, becoming the ancestor of every safety cap and latch we use today. Medieval builders did not think about the average person either. They built for power and beauty, not for practicality. Stairs were steep and uneven. Bridges were narrow and slick. Towers had no guardrails. It was not until someone's heir or guest died that adjustments were made. When a noble's child fell from a balcony, the masons did not weep for long, they just added a small wall. When a worker fell from a cathedral, the next one got a rope. Every safeguard was a reaction to grief. And every lord who installed one could pretend it was foresight. In battle, the same rule applied. Knights went into combat with faith as their armor, convinced that God would protect them. Helmets were optional, padding was rare. And then the wars came, the crusades, the civil feuds, the endless skirmishes where head wounds turned faith into statistics. Slowly, blacksmiths started adding layers, metal bowls to shield the skull, leather underlining for comfort, holes for air. The great helm, that iconic closed metal helmet, did not appear because knights loved innovation, it appeared because knights kept collapsing from heat or dying from blows to the head. The design of courage had to make room for pain. The same reactive logic governed towns and cities. Wells were open pits in crowded markets. People leaned too far and fell in. Animals slipped, drowned, and poisoned the water. The next generation of builders added wooden lids. Problem solved until someone forgot to close them. So locks appeared, and later small houses built over the wells. It was a long, clumsy climb toward the simple idea that danger can be predicted. Even in faith, people learned the hard way. For centuries, villagers believed that ringing church bells during storms would scare away demons. It did not. Instead, lightning traveled down the metal bells, along the ropes, and straight into the bell ringer's hands. Parish records quietly began to include deaths labeled smote by thunder while performing duty. After a while, churches issued rules, no ringing during storms. It was not science yet, but it was adaptation, the first whisper of maybe we should not do that again. If this all sounds absurd, remember that every era has its blind spots. We think we are smarter now because we have warning labels and engineers, but most of those systems were also born from disaster. Airbags came after crashes. Fire codes came after infernos. Medical gloves came after epidemics. The only difference is that our memory is institutional. Medieval Europe had to rely on the memory of individuals. If no one survived to remember, the lesson vanished. What makes the medieval story so human is that it is never about perfection. They did not have blueprints or checklists. They had stories, tragic, embarrassing, often ridiculous stories. The knight who drowned in the moat, the monk who caught fire during prayer, the queen whose chamber collapsed under poor carpentry. And each story carried a seed of progress. Next time, let us do this differently. That is how safety evolved, not through theory, but through gossip and grief. There is also something humbling about how slow it all was. Decades, sometimes centuries, passed before one good idea became common. A candle guard in a monastery might take 200 years to appear in a peasant's home. Distance, poverty, and pride made innovation crawl. Lords thought safety was beneath them. Peasants thought safety was too expensive. In between, craftsmen quietly fixed what they could. Yet, through that slow grind, a mindset began to change. By the late Middle Ages, people started to anticipate. Town councils passed laws about waste disposal. Builders reinforced bridges. Merchants installed locks on doors not just to guard treasure, but to prevent fires and theft. The shift from after to before had begun. It was not industrial or scientific, it was cultural. People began to expect that things should not kill them by accident. You could say this was the birth of the modern safety instinct. The quiet understanding that prevention is cheaper than catastrophe. It did not come from philosophy or religion. It came from lived pain. Every improvement was a memorial to someone who did not get to benefit from it. Still, medieval people would not have described it that way. They did not think in terms of progress. They just tried to make tomorrow a little less dangerous than yesterday. That is what makes their world both terrifying and inspiring, because even surrounded by chaos, they learned. A blacksmith adding padding inside a helmet was not thinking about history. A cook moving the kitchen outdoors was not thinking about architecture. But both were part of a larger, accidental revolution, humanity's long, clumsy stumble toward foresight. So, when we walk through the ruins of an old castle today and see the ropes along the bridge or the small wall around a tower, we are looking at the first drafts of modern safety. Not inventions of genius, but scars turned into structure. Behind every improvement was someone who did not come home. The Middle Ages were not stupid, they were forgetful until they could not be. Their safety lessons were carved not into textbooks but into tombstones. They remind us that wisdom does not always arrive with a plan. Sometimes it arrives late, muddy, and breathing hard, saying, "Let us never do that again." And maybe that is the most human story of all, not a tale of progress, but of persistence. The idea that people, even in their darkest times, eventually learn to protect what matters. Sometimes after the first death, sometimes after 100. But always, eventually. Because survival, even when clumsy, is its own kind of brilliance. If there is one feature that defines a medieval castle, it is the moat, wide, deep, and filled with dark water that mirrored the sky and the arrogance of whoever built it. To the outside world, a moat looked like the ultimate line of defense, a warning that said, "You can come this far, but no further." But for the people who actually lived behind those stone walls, it was something else entirely, a trap. A silent, filthy, and entirely human-made hazard. Let us start with what a moat really was. It was not a romantic blue ring like you see in fairy tale drawings. It was a ditch, usually wide, sometimes dry, and often disgusting. It caught rainwater, kitchen runoff, animal waste, and whatever else the castle did not want nearby. When the moat did fill, it became a swamp of bacteria and sludge. If you fell in, you did not just drown. You inhaled the Middle Ages. At first, no one thought of it as dangerous. Lords loved their moats. A wide, water-filled trench looked powerful. Visitors gasped at its depth. Enemies hesitated. And in a world obsessed with symbols, nothing said "I am untouchable" quite like a shimmering pool between you and everyone else. But that illusion shattered quickly once people realized that the moat was not killing enemies, it was killing them. Imagine a winter night in a castle courtyard. The air smells of smoke and ale. Torches flicker. A servant carrying a bucket crosses the narrow wooden bridge that connects the keep to the outer gate. One wrong step on the icy plank and she is gone. No one hears the splash over the wind. By morning, the water has frozen over again, hiding the evidence until spring. This was not rare. It was common. And the people who survived long enough to tell the story began to see the moat for what it truly was, a death trap designed by pride. The irony ran deep. The moat was meant to keep danger out, yet it constantly claimed the lives of the very people it was meant to protect. Soldiers on night patrol slipped and vanished. Children playing near the walls drowned before anyone could help. Even noble guests stumbled after too much wine. Chroniclers recorded it politely, an unfortunate accident near the waterworks, but everyone knew what it meant. Eventually, the pattern became impossible to ignore. So began one of the earliest examples of medieval safety reform, though no one would have called it that. Castles started to add small wooden barriers or ropes along the bridges. Some added posts or short railings, purely out of desperation. Guards were instructed to carry lanterns at night, not just to spot invaders but to guide drunk knights back from the tavern. It was not innovation. It was damage control. And still, the accidents continued. Because no one could resist the moat. People bathed in it, washed their clothes in it, even used it as a garbage dump. During sieges, when clean water ran out, desperate defenders drank from it knowing it could make them sick, but preferring fever over thirst. The moat's purpose kept shifting between defense, convenience, and menace. It was everything at once, which made it impossible to manage safely. In some castles, the problem was worse than water. Dry moats were ditches left empty, their sides steep and lined with spikes or stones. During foggy nights, horses fell in. Merchants delivering goods to the gate misjudged the distance and tumbled into the trench. Once inside, there was no way out without ropes or ladders. The lord's men had to haul them up, often breaking bones in the process. The moat did not just defend. It humiliated. One famous chronicler, writing about the fortress of Coucy in France, noted that its moat was so vast that birds hesitated to cross it. The locals joked that it could swallow a whole company of soldiers, and sometimes it nearly did. During construction, scaffolding collapsed, dropping a dozen workers into the half-finished ditch. They suffocated under falling earth. The Lord ordered the trench filled again and started anew, as if the dead were simply part of the foundation. But for all its dangers, people could not let go of the moat. It was too symbolic, too impressive. Every noble wanted one, the way modern homeowners want a gate or a garden. And so the disasters continued. One English castle tried to solve the problem by stocking its moat with fish, thinking the movement of life would purify the water. Instead, the fish died. Another lord dumped lime powder into the water to cleanse it, which did nothing except choke the servants who inhaled the fumes. It was medieval chemistry at its most confident and least effective. Over time, however, experience began to teach caution. Builders widened the bridges and added gentle slopes instead of straight drops. Some filled moats partially, leaving shallow sections near walkways so the fall would not be fatal. Others lined the bottom with reeds or mud to soften the impact. None of this made the moat safe, it just made it slightly less lethal. The real shift happened not in architecture, but in attitude. People began to understand that danger did not have to come from outside. A moat was not evil. It was indifferent. It did not care who fell in. The Middle Ages were full of boundaries meant to separate safety from chaos: castle walls, convent gates, city moats, but they often blurred together. The moat taught people that control and vulnerability live side by side. This realization had quiet consequences. Towns that could not afford castles built moat-like ditches around themselves, smaller, shallower, sometimes just trenches lined with thorns. They served both as defense and drainage. But because the memory of the castle deaths still lingered, these towns designed them differently: wider bridges, sloped sides, warning torches at night. In their humble way, they improved on the mistakes of their betters. The peasant learned what the noble ignored, that safety is not about pride, but about paying attention. There is something poetic about how the moat evolved through history. What began as a weapon of isolation slowly turned into a symbol of awareness. Later in the Renaissance, some castles filled their moats entirely, turning them into ornamental gardens or reflecting pools. It was partly vanity, but also an admission: we no longer need to defend ourselves with death. The moat lost its menace and gained beauty. That transformation is the essence of progress, turning danger into decoration. But even then, echoes of the old fear remained. Travelers and chroniclers kept writing about the curse of the moat, stories where ghosts of drowned servants haunted the bridges, or where the water itself remembered blood. Superstition clung to it because the lesson it carried was too human to forget: the things we build to protect us can just as easily destroy us. The moat was, in a sense, the Middle Ages in miniature, a brilliant idea poisoned by its own lack of foresight. It was both an achievement and a warning, proof that technology without empathy can turn beauty into hazard. And yet, through all the drownings and diseases and quiet tragedies, people learned. They did not stop building moats, but they learned to respect them, to light the paths, To fence the edges. To assign guards not just to keep enemies out, but to keep loved ones alive. That is the quiet miracle of the medieval mind. It learned by suffering, but it learned. Every rope stretched across a bridge, every torch hung beside a gate, was a small act of remembrance. A way of saying, we won't make that mistake again. If you visit a surviving castle today, Château de Chillon in Switzerland, Bodiam in England, Malbork in Poland, you will see their moats shining under the sun, beautiful and calm. Tourists take photos, leaning safely over stone walls that did not exist when the moat was first dug. What they do not realize is that those walls are not there for decoration. They are tombstones in disguise. Each one whispers the same message through the centuries: safety is born from loss, and memory is our only moat against repeating it. The medieval knight was a strange contradiction, the bravest man on the battlefield and often the most fragile. Beneath layers of shining metal was a sweating, gasping human being trying not to pass out before lunch. Early armor was built for glory, not survival. Knights wore it because it looked divine, not because it worked. And like most things in the Middle Ages, every upgrade and protection was bought with blood. In the earliest days of armored combat, people trusted faith more than physics. Soldiers marched into battle in cloth tunics, leather jerkins, or maybe a rusty chain shirt if they were lucky. Helmets were optional, heavy, hot, and considered unmanly by some. There is a famous story of a crusader who refused to wear a helmet, saying, "God will guard my head." A few minutes later, an arrow proved otherwise. That was the rhythm of medieval progress. One man's confidence became everyone else's cautionary tale. The first real innovation came not from kings or commanders, but from blacksmiths who were tired of burying their customers. They noticed how most wounds struck the head, neck, and chest. So they started hammering metal bowls. Simple half-helmets called servaliers. These were not elegant, they were crude, loud, and often slipped off in combat, but they were better than faith alone. Over time, smiths added nose guards, cheek plates, and padding inside. Each improvement was the result of trial, error, and exhaustion. Then came the great helm, that iconic bucket-shaped helmet of the 13th century. It looked invincible, a knight's head turned into a fortress. But inside, it was a sauna. Breathing was hard, vision narrow, hearing nearly gone. Imagine standing under the sun, wrapped in steel, while arrows hiss past and men scream around you. The air inside heats up, the sweat runs into your eyes, and your breath fogs the metal. Some knights fainted before the enemy even reached them. The invincible armor turned them into statues. That problem did not go unnoticed. Squires started cutting holes in the metal, small slits for air, wider gaps for sight. At first, commanders scolded them for weakening the armor. But when fewer men collapsed mid-battle, the holes became standard. That is how medieval engineering worked. Human failure forced redesign. The most famous improvement, the visor, arrived when someone realized you could attach a movable faceplate. Finally, a knight could breathe between fights without removing his entire helmet. It was not comfort. It was survival. The body armor evolved the same way. Chainmail, or mail, was an early triumph of patience, tens of thousands of interlocked rings. It stopped cuts but not blunt trauma. Knights survived swords only to die from crushed ribs. So smiths layered leather under the mail, then added metal plates to the chest, shoulders, and knees. The 14th century saw the birth of full-plate armor, a masterpiece of protection that turned men into walking sculptures. But again, it came with trade-offs: weight, heat, and cost. The poorest soldiers fought half-naked while the rich risked suffocation inside steel cocoons. The human body was not built for this. Knights trained from youth to bear the load up to 30 kilos of metal on their frame. They practiced mounting horses in armor, swinging swords that felt like lead. Their bodies adapted, but only barely. When they fell, it was often over for them. Once you were on your back, your armor became your coffin. There are chronicles of battles where soldiers drowned in shallow streams because their armor dragged them down. Others burned alive when fire met metal too hot to escape. For every knight celebrated in song, dozens died trapped inside their own invention. Still, people adored the sight of armor. It symbolized power, faith, and order. A shining knight was the Middle Ages idea of perfection, a human refined into iron. That illusion blinded them to how deadly it really was. Armor was progress, yes, but it was progress without empathy. Protection came at the cost of breath, agility, and sometimes dignity. After a long day in the sun, nights smelled like cooked meat. But the lessons were learned, slowly. As wars dragged on, blacksmiths became as important as generals. They tested shapes, adjusted balance, studied wounds after battle. They invented flexible joints at elbows and knees, overlapping plates called lames that allowed movement without exposure. The armor became less like a coffin and more like a shell, still heavy, but alive. Each improvement was a quiet nod to the reality that human beings, not heroes, wore it. The shift in thinking spread beyond the battlefield. Armor began to influence architecture and clothing. Cathedrals borrowed its ribbed patterns. Tailors copied its layered design. Even common folk adopted small defensive habits. Workers tied cloth around arms while threshing grain. Cooks wore leather aprons to stop burns. The idea that you could prevent injury instead of merely surviving it had begun to seep into daily life. By the late 15th century, armor reached its peak, a marvel of balance and beauty. Artisans sculpted it like jewelry. Etched lines, gilded edges, intricate joints. A full suit could take months to craft. It made its wearer almost untouchable in hand-to-hand combat. But history, as usual, had a cruel sense of humor. Just as armor reached perfection, the world discovered gunpowder. The musket ball made a mockery of centuries of craftsmanship. A single shot could pierce what 1,000 arrows could not. Knights tried to adapt. They thickened the metal, angled the plates, tested bullets against breastplates before selling them. Some armor even bore small dents-proof marks to show it could withstand fire. But eventually, the math stopped working. You could make armor thick enough to resist bullets, or light enough to move in, but not both. The era of the armored man ended with a sigh, not a scream. Yet the legacy endured. The modern helmet, the firefighter's suit, the bomb disposal gear all trace their ancestry to that same stubborn logic: pain first, progress second. The medieval knight, sweating inside his great helm, was the prototype for every human who ever built a layer between themselves and the world. There is something beautifully tragic about that. The knight wanted to be invincible but learned that invincibility always costs something. The armor kept out the sword but also the air. It saved lives and took them back in equal measure. And yet, each improvement carried hope, a belief that next time, maybe it would not hurt so much. In that sense, medieval armor was not just protection. It was philosophy in metal. It asked the same question every generation still asks: how much safety is worth the wait? How far can we go before what shields us starts to trap us? So the next time you see a knight's armor gleaming in a museum, remember that you are not looking at a symbol of perfection. You are looking at a conversation between fear and invention, a dialogue hammered into steel, one dent at a time. Every curve was shaped by someone's pain, every rivet a memory of what not to do again. The knight's armor tells the same story as the castle moat, the candle guard, the covered well. Humanity learns backwards. We bleed first, then we build. But even in that clumsy order, there is something magnificent, because to keep learning after loss is the most human act of all. If you stood beneath a medieval cathedral or castle and looked up, you would see ambition reaching into the clouds. Towers, parapets, and spires all rising higher than reason demanded. The Middle Ages loved height. It symbolized heaven, dominance, the human desire to look down on chaos and feel momentarily safe. But gravity had no respect for symbolism. The same towers that touched the sky also became silent killers. And long before anyone thought of occupational safety, medieval Europe learned that the higher you built, the faster you fell. The first victims were the builders themselves. Cathedral construction in the 12th and 13th centuries was as dangerous as war. Masons climbed makeshift wooden scaffolds stacked on one another like a child's toy. There were no guardrails, no safety ropes, just faith, balance, and a prayer that today was not the day. A slip meant a freefall from 40 meters onto stone. Contemporary chronicles sometimes described these deaths with chilling brevity. A worker fell from the tower and was buried that afternoon. No ceremony, no inquiry, just another cost of glory. The problem was simple: people overestimated themselves. Builders wanted to reach higher, stretch stone thinner, push arches wider. The Gothic era was obsessed with light and elevation, and in that ambition lay constant risk. Workers labored on icy mornings when ropes froze solid. Gusts of wind could swing a scaffold, sending stones and men crashing below. Helmets did not exist. Neither did harnesses. Even ladders were crude, uneven, and prone to tipping. Cathedral sites were not the only danger zones. Castles and city towers were equally deadly. Lords loved balconies, stone platforms that projected from the walls, offering panoramic views of their lands. But those same balconies had waist-high walls, sometimes even lower, because the architecture prioritized elegance over safety. Add in alcohol, long robes, and night feasts, and you had a recipe for disaster. Chronicles mention more than one noble lost to the void after a celebration. It was not just peasants who fell. Gravity was democratic. Women and children were particularly vulnerable. Picture a castle courtyard bustling with life, dogs running, servants carrying trays, children chasing each other along upper corridors. One moment of distraction, and a life was gone. People tried to adapt by blocking certain stairways or keeping children indoors, but the environment itself was lethal. Even staircases were steep and narrow, designed defensively rather than practically. A single misstep in a long skirt could send someone tumbling down a spiral of stone. The lesson came slowly. Some lords ordered parapets added to their balconies. Low walls thick enough to lean on. Builders began to carve decorative railings into towers and galleries, turning safety into style. Churches added balustrades to cloisters where monks walked in meditation. At first, these details were purely aesthetic, graceful patterns of stone that looked like lacework. But over time, people realized they also saved lives. A tiny wall, barely up to the knee, could mean the difference between devotion and disaster. Still, accidents persisted. The higher Europe climbed, the more bodies piled below. The construction of the Strasbourg Cathedral, for example, spanned centuries, and so did the funerals of its workers. In England, the rebuilding of Canterbury after the Great Fire of 1174 claimed several masons who fell from the new vaulting. Every great tower had ghosts built into its mortar. But because death was common, people did not question it. The word accident did not even mean preventable, yet it meant God's will. And yet, humans have a strange relationship with repetition. We adapt. Monks started to bless building sites, asking protection for workers. Some guilds introduced informal safety rituals, checking ropes before climbing, refusing to work during high winds, covering holes with planks. These were not regulations. They were survival habits. A mason who wanted to see his family again learned to trust his own fear. By the late 13th century, architecture had started to change in subtle ways. Builders widened the walkways at the tops of walls and added raised edges to parapets. Bell towers, notorious for claiming their ringers, gained narrow railings along their inner steps. Even decorative gargoyles served a hidden safety function. They jutted out from ledges, reminding people not to lean too far. The beauty of Gothic architecture, its flying buttresses, its intricate carvings, was also its warning system. But not all improvements came from compassion. Some were driven by reputation. When a noble died in a fall, the scandal rippled through courts. Chroniclers whispered that the fall was divine punishment, that the victim's pride had outpaced their wisdom. To avoid that humiliation, other nobles quietly improved their castles. They added railings, widened stairs, even stationed guards near dangerous spots during feasts. It was not empathy, it was image control. Medieval PR safety. The most ironic place of all was the belfry. Bell towers symbolized the voice of God, calling the faithful to prayer. But climbing them was a nightmare. Narrow ladders spiraled upward through darkness, slippery with dew or dust. Bell ringers worked alone, hauling heavy ropes that could snap their arms or necks if caught. And when lightning struck, as it often did, they were the first to die. The church eventually learned from the carnage, banning bell ringing during storms and adding small railings inside towers. Each improvement came only after another obituary. There is something deeply human about that slowness. We learn from pain, but we learn unevenly. For every lord who added parapets, another refused, calling them ugly. For every cautious builder, there was one who insisted that faith was protection enough. History does not move in a straight line. It stumbles forward, catching itself just before the fall. As Europe urbanized, new dangers emerged. Multi-story homes leaned over narrow streets, their wooden balconies almost touching across the gap. At night, people leaned out to gossip, dump water, or watch festivals below. Falls were so common that city laws began to appear, early building codes, written not for beauty but for self-preservation. Paris, Florence, and London each passed ordinances limiting how far balconies could extend or how high upper floors could project. It was not about urban design. It was about stopping corpses from landing in the street. Even then, ordinary citizens improvised their own safety. They tied ropes between windows, hung lanterns for visibility, or placed planks across gaps as makeshift rails. Sailors brought home lessons from ships' netting and knots used to steady themselves on land. Every solution carried the same message: we are tired of falling. Over centuries, the fear of heights transformed into architecture itself. The soaring cathedrals that once killed their builders became, in time, places where people stood safely to marvel at the vaults above. By the Renaissance, scaffolds included rails and ladders with fixed joints. Builders began to calculate loads and angles, though they did not yet call it engineering. The human body was finally being measured alongside stone. And yet, if you look at medieval ruins today, you still feel the danger in their design. The stairs twist too tightly. The ledges end too soon. The walls invite you to lean, to test, to tempt gravity. These buildings carry centuries of stories, some told in stained glass, others in silence. Every chipped edge and worn step is a reminder that progress was once measured not in years, but in bodies. What makes this story haunting is not just the loss, but the blindness. People did not fall because they were foolish. They fell because the world had not yet invented the idea that safety is a responsibility. The Middle Ages taught that lesson through repetition. Every fall carved the truth deeper into the collective mind: height demands respect. So the next time you see a Gothic tower rising against the sky, do not just admire its beauty. Think of the hands that built it without harnesses. The workers who prayed each morning not to become part of the foundation. Think of the nobles who leaned too far over balconies, of the children who vanished from castle corridors. Their stories became invisible laws, written into every railing and every parapet that came after. The medieval world's obsession with height gave us masterpieces but also warnings carved in stone. Each fall was a message whispered from one generation to the next. If you reach for heaven, remember to build something to hold on to. If there is one thing the Middle Ages did not handle gracefully, it was plumbing. Castles were feats of architecture, walls that could stop armies, towers that kissed the clouds but the toilets. They were open holes in wooden seats, perched over long vertical shafts that emptied straight down into pits or rivers. The medieval toilet, politely called a garderobe, was an exercise in faith. You sat above darkness and hoped the floorboards held. And more than once, they did not. For all their grandeur, medieval people lived surrounded by waste. Hygiene as we understand it did not exist. The garderobe was seen as a marvel of convenience, a private seat built into the castle wall so you did not have to trek outside in the rain. The waste fell through the shaft, sometimes landing in a cesspit, sometimes in a moat, sometimes directly on the hillside below. If you were lucky, there was straw to wipe with. If you were very lucky, moss. The smell. A permanent resident. Servants carried herbs or burned incense near the openings, but it was a losing battle. The problem was not just the smell, it was the danger. Garderobes were made of wood, and wood rots. The shafts were deep, narrow, and often slick with moisture. Over time, the boards weakened. People would lean back or shift their weight and suddenly find themselves falling into the abyss. For the poor, it was humiliation. For the rich, it was tragedy. There are actual records, grim, almost comic in their phrasing, of nobles meeting their end whilst at his seat. One of the most famous cases is that of Wenceslas III's cousin, the unfortunate German nobleman who fell through a collapsing toilet seat in the 14th century and drowned in the cesspit below. Chroniclers wrote about it delicately, calling it a shameful death, but the message was clear: no one, not even the wealthy, was safe from poor carpentry. In some castles, people refused to use certain garderobes after accidents, believing them cursed. Others started reinforcing the boards with iron bands or stone slabs, a small, grim step toward modern bathroom safety. But the dangers went beyond falling. Garderobes were breeding grounds for disease. The shafts, warm and damp, attracted flies and rats, which carried infections back into kitchens and sleeping chambers. In summer, the smell became so unbearable that nobles relocated their entire households to other residences. For peasants, who used open pits or communal latrines, illness was part of life. Dysentery, cholera, and plague all found allies in the medieval sewage system. Yet people did not see the connection. Illness was blamed on bad air or divine punishment, not the obvious filth beneath their feet. Architects, in their defense, did try to innovate. Some castles installed multiple garderobes stacked vertically, sharing one shaft, a multi-floor solution that only spread the stench more efficiently. Others built waste chutes that led directly into moats, which made moats even deadlier. Rain occasionally washed the contents back toward the walls, turning courtyards into swamps of disease. And yet, for centuries, this system was seen as progress. It was better than buckets, better than walking outside at night. People accepted the trade-off: comfort over cleanliness, convenience over caution. The garderobe even carried social symbolism. It was a mark of prestige. To have a private toilet indoors, away from prying eyes, meant status. Servants and soldiers relieved themselves wherever they could, but nobles had seats carved into the stone walls, some decorated with carvings or curtains. The irony was cruel: the higher one's social rank, the greater the drop below. The term garderobe itself is revealing. It comes from French, meaning to guard one's robes. People believed hanging clothes near the toilet kept them free of lice. The fumes supposedly killed pests. It is almost poetic. In trying to protect their garments, they sat beside danger. Over time, garderobes became literal closets, rooms to store clothes, later evolving into what we now call wardrobes. The shift in meaning mirrors humanity's slow retreat from filth to function. By the late Middle Ages, towns began to face the consequences of centuries of poor sanitation. Rivers turned black. Wells became contaminated. Outbreaks spread faster. City councils issued primitive sanitation laws. Latrines must be covered, waste must not be dumped into public streets, cesspits must be cleaned twice a year. But the technology to make these rules effective did not exist yet. Cleaning a cesspit meant lowering a worker called a gong farmer in England down into the pit with a bucket. They shoveled human waste for pennies, often dying young from the fumes. The job was so despised that workers could only work at night, to avoid being seen. Still, some towns learned to manage. Venice, for example, built channels that flushed waste away with tidal water. Monasteries developed enclosed drains leading to streams. These systems were not hygienic by modern standards, but they marked the beginning of intentional sanitation, the understanding that waste needed direction. The lesson came not from morality, but from mortality. Castles, though, lagged behind. The garderobe remained standard until the 16th century. Stone seats, wooden lids, and pits below dangerous, smelly, and accepted. Visitors sometimes wrote about them in travel diaries with a mix of awe and disgust. One Italian ambassador, after staying at a Scottish castle, described the experience as a war between dignity and nature. That single phrase sums up medieval hygiene perfectly. The constant tension between comfort and decay. Eventually, people started experimenting with design. They added wooden lids to cover the hole when not in use, mostly to keep out the smell, but also to prevent accidents. Later, they used iron grates or ropes to hang over the opening, offering balance. In wealthier homes, garderobes were placed inside small stone projections, called toilets turrets, which jutted out from the castle wall so the waste dropped away from the structure. Some even had miniature roofs, protecting users from rain and wind. These small changes might seem trivial now, but in their time, they were revolutionary. They represented the shift from endurance to intention, from merely surviving discomfort to redesigning it. The garderobe also taught a deeper cultural lesson: privacy had limits. Even kings were not alone in their privies. Servants waited nearby to carry torches, to fetch water, sometimes even to assist with robes. The act of using the toilet was not hidden, just relocated. The concept of a closed, personal bathroom would take centuries more to appear. The Middle Ages were not embarrassed by bodily functions, they were simply unprepared for the consequences. And those consequences echoed far beyond castles. Every epidemic, every stinking river, every bad air blamed on God was in part a byproduct of a world that did not understand what was under its own floorboards. The garderobe, in its crude practicality, was both progress and poison. It solved one problem, where to go, but created many others. When modern archaeologists excavate castles today, they can find garderobes immediately. They are the small chambers with narrow slits or vertical shafts running down the walls. Sometimes, the shafts are still full of medieval material layers of waste preserved by time. These finds tell stories not just of diet and disease, but of daily fear. The fear of falling, of suffocating, of infection. Safety did not begin in the armory or the chapel, it began in the privy. It is almost darkly poetic to realize that one of the first true safety innovations in domestic architecture was the toilet lid. A simple piece of wood, meant to cover danger when not in use. That idea of containment, of separation between hazard and habit would ripple outward into every field of design. From wells to kitchens. From armor to bridges, medieval people were slowly discovering the same truth: safety begins when we stop trusting luck. So, when we picture the Middle Ages, it is easy to romanticize castles and crowns. But beneath those towers, in the smallest stone alcove, lies the real story of progress. Every reinforced seat, every added lid, every cautious step toward cleanliness was a quiet rebellion against chaos. The garderobe was not just a toilet, it was a reminder that even in an age of knights and miracles, survival often depended on something as humble as a stronger plank of wood. Fire was the one guest no medieval home could keep out. It cooked, it warmed, it lit the night, but it also devoured everything it touched. The Middle Ages were built on wood, thatched roofs, and open flame. A single spark could erase an entire village before dawn. And since people did not yet separate danger from necessity, they treated fire like a wild friend, loved, trusted, and constantly underestimated. Every house, from the poorest hovel to the richest castle, revolved around its hearth. The fire was sacred. It symbolized life, family, and divine blessing. People prayed beside it, cooked over it, and slept near it for warmth. But those same hearths often burned their owners alive. A spark jumping from the grate, a child playing too close. A gust of wind through an open door and suddenly the walls turned orange. Firefighting meant buckets, prayers, and panic. Cities like London, Rouen, and Lubeck lived in perpetual fear of fire. Their buildings leaned over narrow streets, their roofs touched. When one caught flame, the rest followed. The Great Fire of London in 1212 killed thousands. Another in 1666 would destroy most of the city again. But these were not freak disasters, they were symptoms of a world built to burn. People packed straw inside their walls for insulation, stored hay in lofts above kitchens, and used candles everywhere. If the wind blew wrong, your house became kindling. In castles, the risk was magnified. Fires often started in kitchens, giant rooms with open hearths big enough to roast an ox. Sparks flew up chimneys, landing on thatched roofs or timber beams. Stone walls could not burn, but everything inside could. And when a fire broke out, escape was nearly impossible. Spiral staircases became chimneys. Wooden doors sealed like ovens. The higher the status, the deadlier the architecture. After enough disasters, people started to adapt. They did not yet understand chemistry or heat transfer, but they learned patterns. The first real safety measure was simple: move the kitchen outside. In many castles, the kitchen became a separate building connected by a short walkway. That one change saved countless lives. Servants could still cook and carry food to the main hall, but if the kitchen went up in flames, the castle might still stand. Next came the candle guards. Candles were the electricity of the Middle Ages, used for everything from reading to worship. But wax dripped, wicks flared, and holders tipped. One careless elbow could start a chain reaction of fire across the draperies. So blacksmiths began crafting metal discs to catch the dripping wax. Then added wire cages around the flame. These early lanterns turned open fire into something almost civilized. They were clumsy, heavy, and smoked badly, but they were a step toward control. Still, humans being humans, most people ignored caution until it was too late. The very act of sleeping carried risk. People left candles burning overnight to ward off evil spirits, a superstition that kept them company until their curtains caught fire. In monasteries, monks fell asleep during late prayers, candles still lit beside parchment scrolls. Whole libraries vanished in seconds. It is almost poetic, centuries of knowledge undone by a nap. Some communities tried to institutionalize prevention. By the 13th century, several European cities had fire watches, night patrols who walked the streets listening for crackling wood or smelling smoke. Bells rang when fire broke out, and everyone was expected to help. The first firefighting equipment appeared around this time: leather buckets, wet blankets, long poles with hooks to tear down burning roofs. The idea was not to put out the fire, it was to stop it from spreading. People understood destruction, if not containment. Rural villages invented their own rituals. Farmers left a small bowl of water beside the hearth for the fire spirit to drink, believing it kept the flame's content. Housewives sprinkled salt on logs before bedtime as protection. Behind these superstitions hid a quiet truth: they were primitive fire safety protocols disguised as faith. In a world without manuals, people made rituals of common sense. And slowly, progress emerged. Builders began experimenting with materials. Stone chimneys replaced open holes in the roof. Brick hearths replaced wooden ones. Even the shape of the house changed: fireproof floors of clay. Detached bakehouses, wider streets. Monks, ever the record keepers, noticed that towns built from stone burned less often. Their report spread, and the idea of planned safety began to flicker across Europe. Still, for every step forward, there were 10 steps back. Peasants could not afford stone. Cities kept rebuilding in wood because it was cheap. Lords demanded grand feasts with roaring fires. People wanted warmth, not caution. And so, generation after generation, fire stayed both servant and executioner. There are stories equal parts tragic and absurd of fires started by animals. A pig knocking over a lantern. A cat brushing against a candle. Even a goose, famously, in a Dutch town, blamed for setting fire to a mill after being startled by lightning. The chronicles rarely mention whether these stories were true. They did not need to be. Everyone knew that, in a world full of flame, chaos needed only a small excuse. One of the biggest changes came when metal stoves arrived in the late Middle Ages. At first, they were luxuries, expensive, heavy, and awkward, but they contained the fire completely. No sparks, no rolling logs, no open flame licking the air. For the first time, fire lived inside a box, and humans began to think of it as something to manage rather than appease. The stove marked a psychological shift, from coexistence to control. Churches also learned. The same cathedrals that once burned like torches began using stone screens to separate candles from woodwork. Metal chandeliers replaced wooden ones. Priests instructed congregants not to bring torches inside during Mass. These might seem like small details, but each represented centuries of trial, error, and repentance. In a sense, every improvement in fire safety was an act of collective memory. By the 15th century, fireproof became a dream word. Architects bragged about stone vaults that could resist flames. Towns passed ordinances requiring each household to keep water nearby. Some even installed public cisterns specifically for fire emergencies. The seeds of the modern fire brigade were planted in these shared fears. When flames no longer felt like fate, they started to look like a challenge. Even language reflects the shift. Earlier chronicles spoke of fires as visitations or purifications. Later documents called them negligence. The tone changed from worship to accountability. People began to admit, quietly, that most disasters were not sent from heaven, they were built by hand, neglected by habit. And that realization was revolutionary. Yet, for all the reform, fire never lost its symbolic power. Painters still depicted it as divine punishment. Poets still used it as metaphor for passion and judgment. But behind the poetry were scorched walls, burned villages, and survivors who'd learned to place their candles inside iron cages. That tension between awe and practicality defines the entire medieval attitude toward safety. If you visit an old castle today, you can still see the marks of that struggle. Kitchens built in courtyards. Soot-blackened chimneys widened after early collapses. Lantern niches carved into stone corridors so servants could carry light safely at night. Each detail was born from experience. Each scar is a manual written in smoke. Fire was both the teacher and the test. It taught humanity to respect what it could not fully control, to invent not out of brilliance but exhaustion. From those early bucket brigades and guarded candles grew the entire modern concept of fire safety: alarms, extinguishers, codes, training. None of it was inevitable. It started when someone, somewhere, stared at the ashes of everything they loved and said, "Never again." The Middle Ages might seem distant, but their fires still burn in our habits. Every time we blow out a candle before sleep, every time we close the stove door, every time a fire alarm rings, we are echoing lessons they learned in flame. The people who built wooden worlds learned the hardest truth of all, that light and destruction often share the same spark. And that survival, in the end, means remembering which one you lit. Thunder meant something different in the Middle Ages. To modern ears, it is just weather, a low roll of sound before the rain. But to a medieval villager, it was the voice of God, or worse, the devil testing his lungs. Lightning was not a natural event. It was judgment. So when it struck a church tower and killed the bell ringer inside, people did not see bad luck, they saw a message. The irony is brutal. Those who died trying to protect their towns from storms were often the very reason safety began to evolve. For centuries, Europe had one ritual response to thunderstorms: ring the bells. When clouds gathered and the first crack of thunder shook the ground, priests would order the bells to sound. The logic was both spiritual and social. The sound of the bell, they believed, could scatter evil spirits, calm the storm, and remind the heavens that people below were praying. Entire villages relied on it. The bigger the storm, the louder the ringing. It was beautiful and fatal. Because the thing about church towers is they are tall. Very tall. Often the highest structure for miles. Tipped with a spire that practically invited lightning. The bells themselves were metal, suspended by ropes that ran straight down to the floor where the ringer stood. When a bolt hit the tower, it traveled through the metal, into the rope, and directly into the person holding it. Many did not even have time to let go. The deaths became so common that chroniclers stopped describing them with surprise. Smote by thunder while in service became a quiet formula repeated in parish records. Some accounts described how the blast would throw the ringer across the belfry, or how the entire tower would shake as if alive. Sometimes the wooden beams caught fire. Sometimes the bell itself cracked from the heat. In the aftermath, villagers would climb the tower, find the ringer's body blackened but still standing, the rope fused to their hand. At first, people did not connect cause and effect. They thought lightning specifically targeted the pious, it was divine jealousy, or proof that the heavens were angry. So instead of stopping the bell ringing, they rang harder. Towns competed over whose bells could defy the storm most faithfully. The louder, the holier. And the death toll rose accordingly. By the late 14th century, rumors spread of cursed bells, those that had been struck more than once. People began to fear them, believing they carried demonic energy. In some towns, entire bell towers were abandoned. Others hired outsiders, condemned men, or debtors to ring during storms, promising them forgiveness if they survived. It was a grim medieval compromise, salvation in exchange for electrocution. Then, quietly, the pattern began to shift. Monks, ever the observers, started noticing details. Bells struck by lightning often shared certain traits: higher towers, metal-tipped spires, ropes left wet or uninsulated. The connection was primitive but real. They were beginning to think mechanically, not mystically. In 1752, long after the Middle Ages had passed, Benjamin Franklin would invent the lightning rod, but the groundwork for understanding had been laid centuries earlier by people who learned through tragedy. The Church's response evolved too, though slowly. Some dioceses issued bans against bell ringing during storms, declaring it tempting divine wrath. Others suggested prayers instead, silent vigils rather than ringing. The change did not come from science, but from fatigue. Too many funerals, too many burned towers. Eventually, survival began to sound holier than ritual. Even so, superstition lingered. In rural France and Germany, the phrase "to ring away the thunder" stayed popular well into the 18th century. Farmers swore that bells could still break the clouds. Bells themselves were believed to have protective powers. Many bore Latin inscriptions like "Fulgor affrango," I break lightning, cast into their bronze. Each chime was a prayer forged in metal. But faith can't outshout physics. It is worth pausing to picture the moment itself: the bell ringer, alone in the high stone tower, thunder crashing around him. He grips the rope, his hands raw, his breath echoing off the walls. He believes he is saving his town. Outside, people kneel, whispering prayers, watching the tower glow with every flash. Then one bolt finds its mark, and the light inside the tower is brighter than any candle. The villagers hear a sound louder than thunder, the final ring, and then silence. That silence must have felt like the end of the world. When the church finally stopped the practice, they did it quietly. No one wanted to admit centuries of error. Instead, they reframed it as reverence. Storms were to be met with humility, not noise. The bells remained sacred, but they fell silent when lightning came. This small shift, a change in ritual, not just engineering, marks the birth of risk awareness. The understanding that devotion should not require a death wish. Some towns tried to take matters further. Builders began adding wooden spikes or iron rods atop towers, believing they could distract the lightning away from the bell. The logic was not entirely wrong, but the materials made it worse: wood burned, iron conducted. True protection would not come until Franklin's grounded rod centuries later. Still, these early attempts were remarkable. They showed that humans, even steeped in superstition, could inch toward reason through repetition. The psychological toll was heavy, too. Bell ringers became reluctant heroes. Their job was essential. They marked time, death, weddings, harvests, and storms, but it carried stigma. Some were paid extra to ring during dangerous weather. Others refused altogether and were branded cowards. Communities needed their sound but ignored their suffering. The medieval world often worked that way: safety for the many bought by the few who could not escape the risk. Over time, the bell tower itself changed. Architects shortened spires, thickened walls, and replaced wood with stone. Rope holes were lined with clay or leather to reduce conduction. Later designs even separated the ringer's room from the bell chamber, an early version of distancing. These small architectural tweaks, born from grief, turned towers from death traps into symbols of endurance. But the fear of lightning remained alive in the cultural imagination. Artists painted angels wielding bolts. Poets compared sudden death to the bell ringer's fate. Even into the Renaissance, people whispered about fire from heaven as punishment. Lightning carried mystery long after it stopped carrying souls. What is haunting is how long it took to question the ritual. For hundreds of years, people chose faith over evidence, tradition over life. They watched the same thing happen again and again and told themselves it meant something noble. That pattern, repeating what hurts because it feels sacred, runs through all of human history. But the bell towers remind us that even the most devout customs can evolve when the cost becomes unbearable. If you visit an old European church today, you can still see scorch marks along some bell frames. The metal bells are smoother now, their ropes insulated, their towers grounded. Yet those black streaks of carbon remain a quiet memorial to the hundreds who died ringing the sky. Their story is not about foolishness. It is about devotion colliding with discovery. The lesson they left behind still echoes in every safety rule that followed: courage is useless without understanding. The bell ringers were not wrong to stand in their towers, they were just born too early for lightning rods. They trusted prayer to do the work of physics. And in their deaths, they taught everyone else to separate the two. The next time thunder shakes the air and church bells fall silent, that silence is a monument. It carries centuries of learning, fear, and humility. It is the sound of progress, the kind that arrives late, carved from loss, ringing quietly across time. Picture a medieval town at dusk. The market is closing, carts creak home through narrow streets, and the last sunlight bounces off puddles that smell faintly of sewage. Chickens dart between people's feet. The noise is constant bells, hooves, shouting. It is beautiful in a grimy way, but it is also one accident away from disaster. Wells lie uncovered, bridges have no rails, and torches sway too close to cloth banners. Every corner hides something that can kill you quietly. For most of the Middle Ages, public safety was not a concept. A city existed to trade, pray, and defend itself, not to protect its residents from themselves. The common belief was that life was hard because God meant it to be. If you tripped into a well, or got crushed by a passing cart, it was fate, not design. But as towns grew denser, people started to notice a strange pattern. When one careless act killed someone, it often took others with it. And so began the slow birth of public space reform, the moment when medieval cities started to guard their people instead of just enclosing them. It started, as usual, with tragedy. A child fell into a well in Rouen. A horse plunged through a weak bridge in Florence. A baker's torch burned half of York. People mourned, complained, and moved on until the same things happened again. Eventually, grief turned into rules. Town councils began to pass ordinances, some crude, some brilliant. Wells had to be covered with wooden lids or iron grates. Bridges were to have side chains or low rails. Street vendors could not block fire lanes. No open flames during curfew hours. These early laws were fragile and inconsistently enforced. But they marked a radical shift. Human error was becoming something society could prevent. The simplest improvement was light. Medieval streets were dark, dangerously so. Candles were expensive, oil scarce, and torches unreliable. After sunset, most people stayed indoors, and those who ventured out carried lanterns, their flames trembling in the wind. Thieves thrived in this darkness, and so did accidents. People fell into ditches or stumbled over trash heaps. Town leaders eventually introduced curfews, not just to stop crime but to reduce chaos. Bells rang to signal lights out, and guards patrolled the empty streets. What began as social control accidentally became safety policy. Some cities went further. Paris installed the first municipal lanterns in the 14th century, wooden posts with small cages of flame hung at intersections. They were meant to comfort travelers and deter crime. But they also kept people from breaking their necks in the dark. It was, in essence, the first street light system, maintained by paid lamplighters who replaced the oil and trimmed the wicks each evening. Citizens grumbled about taxes but quickly noticed fewer corpses in the gutters. Water, too, became a focus. Wells and cisterns were lifelines, but they were also open traps. Children drowned, animals fell in, and diseases spread through contaminated water. In England, ordinances began requiring lids for public wells, while in Italian cities, wells were enclosed within small stone houses. Some even employed guards to prevent people from dumping waste inside, a sign that public health was slowly emerging as a civic duty. It was not compassion. It was economics. Dead citizens did not pay taxes. Bridges, meanwhile, were nightmares. Medieval builders often focused on beauty and symbolism, constructing arched stone spans adorned with shrines or statues but no rails. Horses slipped, carts overturned, and merchants tumbled into rivers along with their goods. After enough drownings, cities began adding barriers. In some places, chains stretched between posts. In others, full parapets appeared. Venice, whose bridges crossed canals filled with traffic, learned early that decoration could coexist with safety. Their elegant marble railings became an early model for functional beauty. Markets posed another problem. In bustling towns, stalls lined every major street, narrowing passageways until fire wagons could not pass. During emergencies, chaos ruled. People blocked exits, goods caught flame, and thieves looted in the confusion. Slowly, town charters introduced zoning rules. Markets could only operate in designated squares. Fires could not be lit within a certain distance of buildings. Water barrels had to be kept nearby. The medieval idea of order was expanding from morality to infrastructure. And then there was waste, the silent killer beneath everything. Streets were open sewers. People tossed chamber pots from windows with a casual guard low, "Watch out below." A phrase that became both warning and apology. The mess spread disease and made walking treacherous. When plagues hit, city leaders finally understood the link between cleanliness and survival. Regulations appeared: no dumping waste near wells, no butchering animals in alleys, no corpses left unburied within town walls. Public hygiene was not yet science, but it was becoming governance. One of the most transformative rules was the night watch. Initially, these were guards meant to catch criminals. But they quickly became the first responders for fires, floods, and injuries. They carried horns to sound alarms, helped lost travelers, and sometimes escorted drunk citizens home safely. Their presence turned public space from an ungoverned wilderness into something resembling community care. You could say they were the ancestors of firefighters, police, and paramedics all rolled into one. Even architecture started adapting. Town gates were locked at night not just to keep enemies out, but to keep drunks and thieves in check. Squares widened to prevent fires from jumping between roofs. Cobblestones replaced mud, reducing slips and ankle breaks. And in some forward-thinking cities, Bruges, Lübeck, Siena, public fountains were built, providing clean water for all. It was not altruism. It was survival disguised as civic pride. The church played a quiet role, too. Many monasteries had strict cleanliness rules: washing hands before meals, covering wells, isolating the sick. Towns often copied these habits, especially after realizing monks died less frequently in epidemics. Priests preached about moderation in taverns, not because they cared about drunkenness, but because drunks were the ones falling off bridges or setting their homes ablaze. Slowly, moral order and physical safety began to merge. Of course, progress was uneven. Rural villages lagged centuries behind cities. Many saw safety rules as an insult to divine will. "If God wills you to drown, you will drown," one chronicler quoted a farmer saying. But cities were different, packed, loud, combustible. They could not afford fatalism anymore. Each rule carved into a wooden post or shouted by a town crier was a small rebellion against chaos. And though the motives were not always noble, the results changed everything. Covered wells reduced disease. Fire curfews saved homes. Bridges stopped claiming travelers. The medieval city was still dangerous, but it had finally started to recognize itself as a shared environment. For the first time, safety was not just an individual concern, it was collective memory turned into policy. There is something quietly heroic about that shift. No one invented public safety in a single moment. It grew like ivy around tragedy. Each reform came from someone saying, "We can't keep doing this." A lid on a well. A rope on a bridge. A rule about lanterns after dark. These were not grand inventions, but they formed the skeleton of modern urban life. If you walk through an old European town today, Bruges, Rothenburg, Siena, you can still see the ghosts of those reforms. The narrow streets curve to slow carts. The bridges have rails. Wells sit behind wrought iron gates. The beauty tourists admire is also a history of caution. Every polished stone once solved a problem that killed someone. Medieval safety was not born in cathedrals or courts. It was born in streets where people tripped, burned, and drowned until they could not bear it anymore. Civilization advanced one railing, one lid, one lantern at a time. And maybe that is the truest image of progress, not a leap forward, but a community learning together how to stop falling into the same holes. The medieval plague doctor is one of history's strangest figures, half healer, half omen. Dressed in a long black coat, gloves, and that bird-like mask with a beak filled with herbs, he looked more like a creature from a nightmare than a man of science. Yet behind that eerie image was something remarkable, the first unintentional experiment in personal protective equipment. Centuries before anyone understood germs, medieval Europe had stumbled into the idea of barrier safety born not from knowledge, but from terror. The Black Death of the 14th century tore through Europe with unimaginable speed. It did not just kill people. It unstitched the fabric of daily life. Families sealed themselves indoors, priests refused last rites, and carts full of corpses rattled down cobblestone streets. The air itself was blamed. People called it miasma, bad air, a poisonous fog that seeped from rotting bodies and corrupted the soul. The logic was simple: breathe it in, and you die. That belief gave birth to the most iconic outfit in medieval medicine. The plague doctor's long-beaked mask was not meant to frighten. It was meant to filter. The beak held strong-smelling herbs, mint, rose, camphor, cloves, or vinegar-soaked sponges to purify the air before it reached the lungs. The rest of the outfit followed the same principle: keep the body sealed off. A long waxed coat prevented contact with infected skin. Gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat completed the look. A wooden stick was carried not as a weapon, but as a tool to prod patients, lift sheets, and measure distance without touching. It is almost funny now, in a morbid way. None of it worked the way they thought it did. The herbs did not clean the air, and the stick did not stop fleas, the real carriers of plague, from leaping. Yet, unintentionally, these doctors had invented pay. The beak acted like a primitive respirator, the waxed cloak like a hazmat suit. They survived slightly longer than those who worked unprotected, and that small difference kept the idea alive. Maybe death was not random. Maybe barriers mattered. Before the plague, medicine in Europe was as much philosophy as practice. Illness was divine punishment or imbalance of the humor's blood. Phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Doctors focused on astrology, not anatomy. But the scale of the Black Death shattered faith in old ideas. Monks died in their cells, kings died in their castles, and nothing, no prayer, no potion seemed to help. For the first time, people began to see disease not as judgment, but as contagion. Something physical, transferable, preventable. That mental shift changed everything. Cities started issuing quarantine orders. The word itself comes from quaranta. Giorni, 40 days. The period ships had to wait outside Venetian ports before passengers could enter. It was arbitrary at first, inspired by biblical numerology, but it worked. The delay kept infected travelers from bringing disease inland. From that small act of patience came the foundation of modern public health. Quarantine was not about faith. It was about time, and time meant survival. Venice was the first to formalize it, building lazarettos, or plague hospitals, on isolated islands. Other cities followed. These were grim places, more prisons than hospitals, but they had one vital function: containment. People did not yet understand bacteria, but they could see patterns. Those who touched the sick became sick. Those who stayed away did not. Observation replaced doctrine, and science began to whisper beneath the screams. The mask itself evolved too. Early versions were simple cloths tied around the mouth. As fear deepened, so did the layers. Leather replaced linen. Glass eyepieces were added to protect from infectious vapors. Even the choice of herbs changed depending on what smell people thought could overpower death. Some doctors stuffed their beaks so full they could barely breathe. Still, they believed they were armored against invisible demons. And in a way, they were. Beyond the doctors, society adapted in strange, brilliant ways. Grave diggers wrapped scarves over their faces. Families burned incense in homes. Merchants fumigated coins with vinegar before exchanging them. Monks designed long-handled censers to spread herbs through church aisles. Everything smelled of fear and smoke. The entire continent had turned into a laboratory of desperation. Even art reflected the new obsession with protection. Paintings depicted death as a skeletal figure carrying a scythe, but people began adding barriers. Veils, cloaks, even invisible shields of light. It was as if humanity had finally realized that distance could save them. The medieval mind was slowly learning to separate the sacred from the sanitary. Of course, not everyone adapted. Many saw the plague doctor's costume as blasphemy, a mockery of God's power. Others thought the doctors were carriers of the disease themselves. In some towns, mobs attacked them, convinced that their masks spread poison. The irony is painful: the first people to wear protective gear were punished for surviving. Yet over time, the image of the masked doctor became a symbol of courage, the man who walked into hell when everyone else ran away. The lessons of plague protection rippled forward long after the Black Death ended. By the 15th century, surgeons began covering their faces during operations, inspired by the idea that bad air could infect wounds. Hospitals improved ventilation and isolated patients. Ships carried inspection documents proving their crews were disease-free, the ancestor of the modern health certificate. Entire professions grew around prevention: watchmen, fumigators, disinfectors. They were not scientists, but they were learning to think like ones. The biggest change, though, was psychological. Before the plague, Europeans believed safety was moral, behave well, and God spares you. Afterward, they realized safety could be mechanical. You could wear it, build it, enforce it. And that realization, born in the stench of corpses, became one of civilization's quiet revolutions. We tend to look back on those beaked masks with unease, as if they symbolize ignorance. But maybe they deserve more credit. Those strange doctors were the first to admit that the world could hurt you in ways you could not see, and that you could still fight back without understanding everything. Their methods were clumsy, yes, but their instinct was right: protect the body, and the mind might follow. It is eerie how familiar their fear feels now. The masks, the isolation, the suspicion between neighbors. In every pandemic since, we have reenacted their story, more sophisticated, more informed, but still human. Each time, we rediscover the same fragile truth: safety does not come from certainty. It comes from humility. From accepting that we are vulnerable, and acting anyway. The plague doctors did not cure the Black Death. They could not. But they did something arguably more important: they changed the script. They replaced fatalism with pragmatism, fear with precaution. Their waxed coats and glass-eyed masks were humanity's first fumbling step toward the modern idea of prevention. And like all early safety measures, they began not with brilliance, but with grief. If you ever see one of those masks in a museum, imagine the man inside it. He is sweating, his vision is blurred, his heart is pounding. He smells herbs and decay. Outside, a family begs him to help. He knows he probably can't. But he steps forward anyway, because stepping forward feels better than waiting to die. That impulse to protect, to adapt, to survive was the Middle Ages' greatest invention. Not the armor or the cathedral or the sword, but the simple, stubborn idea that we can build something, however crude, between ourselves and death. Medieval Europe did not only fear disease or fire, it feared itself. Beneath the stone cathedrals and orderly prayers, people lived with a constant awareness that human nature was its own kind of danger. Violence, lust, greed, gluttony, these were not just sins. They were contagions. And just as the era built moats against invaders and helmets against swords, it built invisible walls against temptation. The Middle Ages tried to invent moral safety the same way it invented physical safety, through trial, control, and an endless effort to keep chaos on a leash. A tavern, for example, was a kind of fire hazard of the soul. Alcohol loosened tongues. Fights broke out, secrets spilled, and the line between laughter and sin blurred fast. Town authorities began to regulate them, not just for order, but for virtue. Curfews were imposed. Women were forbidden from entering after dusk. Musicians could be banned if their songs inflamed the spirit. Some cities even required tavern owners to lock their barrels at night. It was not about sobriety, it was about containment. Keeping pleasure fenced so it did not leak into the streets. The Church, always alert to human weakness, treated vice like infection. Convents and monasteries were their quarantine zones, places where desire was purified through isolation and routine. Inside, monks followed strict schedules, not only to please God, but to protect themselves from wandering thoughts. Bells dictated when to pray, eat, and sleep. Silence was the safest language. Every rule, every fast, every restriction served the same function as a safety railing, to stop people from falling over the edge of their own impulses. But it was not just the religious who lived under moral architecture. Secular towns built their own systems of restraint. Sumptuary laws told people what they could wear based on class and gender, an attempt to keep pride from spreading like a fever. Gambling was banned or limited to festival days. Brothels were moved outside city walls. Not abolished but contained, a pragmatic balance between purity and practicality. Society did not aim to cure sin, only to manage it. It is tempting to see this as hypocrisy, a world of priests preaching virtue while everyone sinned in secret, but it was more complicated. People genuinely believed morality had physical consequences. A community steeped in vice could anger heaven and bring down famine or plague. A drunk guard could let enemies in through the gate. A lustful priest could corrupt an entire parish. In that worldview, every moral failure was a safety breach, every indulgence a spark waiting to catch. So they built systems of surveillance. Parish priests kept lists of notorious sinners. Guilds fined members for swearing, skipping church, or getting caught in taverns during work hours. In small towns, neighbors watched each other like smoke watchers looking for fire. The confessional booth, which emerged in the 13th century, became the psychological equivalent of a fire alarm, a place to release pressure before guilt combusted. Of course, control had its costs. The same walls that kept chaos out also trapped humanity inside. Convents overflowed with women sent there not out of faith but convenience, daughters considered too rebellious, widows too independent. Monks confessed to impure dreams as if they were crimes. Even laughter could be suspect. Theologians debated whether Jesus ever smiled. The safest soul, it seemed, was the one that stayed perfectly still. Yet these systems worked, in their way. They created predictability. A monk knew his next hour before it began. A peasant knew when bells would ring. Even sinners had structure, confessions on Sunday, indulgences for sale on feast days. This rhythm kept panic at bay. In an age without science, moral order was safety. It explained storms, justified sickness, and turned random suffering into moral narrative. The walls of virtue were psychological architecture against despair. Still, humans being humans, the cracks showed. Every time the church tightened control, resistance followed. The tavern, for all its restrictions, remained the one place people spoke freely. Pilgrimages became both spiritual and sensual journeys. Carnivals turned the world upside down, peasants dressed as kings. Priests joined parades, rules vanished for a few ecstatic days. These moments of chaos were not just rebellion. They were necessary release valves. Even safety needs its opposite. Without it, people suffocate. The irony is that medieval moral systems often stumbled into real psychological insight. Modern therapy would call it self-regulation. They called it penance. Confession gave people a way to offload guilt. Fasting taught restraint. Monastic silence reduced anxiety. They did not know the language of trauma or impulse control, but they built rituals that soothed the same wounds. In trying to save their souls, they accidentally stabilized their minds. The Church's obsession with temptation also reshaped physical space. Architecture became moral geography. Cathedrals were designed to lift the gaze upward, away from flesh toward heaven. Stained glass filtered harsh sunlight into holy color, softening the world into something bearable. Even city planning followed moral lines: brothels by the river, markets near the church, gallows at the gate, a cartography of sin and salvation. Morality was not just preached. It was mapped. And like all safety systems, moral control evolved from reaction. Each scandal triggered a new rule. When priests fathered children, celibacy was enforced. When pilgrims turned to banditry, routes were supervised. When heretics spread new ideas, censorship tightened. Every moral disaster left a scar in law. The Church did not foresee sin. It cleaned up afterward, learning its own version of the medieval safety cycle: transgression, outrage, reform, repetition. Not everyone saw safety in obedience, though. Mystics and reformers argued that true protection came from within, that fear was the real poison. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen or Francis of Assisi preached that harmony with creation, not walls or punishment, brought peace. They saw divine love as a safer force than divine wrath. Their ideas were dangerous precisely because they loosened control. But in time, they helped shift morality from external policing to internal conscience, an early step toward personal ethics rather than imposed virtue. By the end of the Middle Ages, Europe was tired of being watched. The Reformation broke the old system wide open. The same discipline that had once made people feel safe now felt suffocating. Printing presses spread forbidden ideas faster than the church could censor them. Safety no longer meant submission. It meant truth, reason, individual conscience. But that rebellion only happened because, for centuries, people had lived inside the experiment of moral containment. They would tested obedience to its limit and learned what it could and could not protect. When we talk about moral safety controls, now laws, social norms, ethical codes, we are living in the echo of that experiment. The medieval world proved that order can prevent chaos, but also that too much order breeds new kinds of harm. Every curfew and confessional, every locked tavern and guarded convent, was a medieval attempt to engineer the human soul like a fortress. It is easy to mock them for it, but maybe we should not. They were trying, in their own language, to build peace out of impulse. To keep the fire of life burning without letting it burn the house down. The Middle Ages did not perfect morality any more than they perfected hygiene or architecture. But they did something harder: they faced their own instability head-on. And even if their rules seem harsh now, they leave us a question that still matters: how much freedom can a society handle before it collapses under the weight of its own desire? Maybe that is the real medieval inheritance, not the punishments or prayers, but the uneasy wisdom that safety is not only about keeping the body from harm. Sometimes, it is about building fences around the heart and knowing when it is time to take them down. When history tells the story of Edward II, King of England from 1307 to 1327, it often begins and ends with scandal. But beneath the sensationalism lies a cautionary tale about human nature, governance, and the deadly intersection of personal affection and political power. Edward's reign was shaped as much by his heart as by the crown on his head, a lesson in how passion can destabilize even the mightiest throne. Edward inherited the English crown from his father, Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots, a monarch celebrated for military prowess, rigid discipline, and unflinching authority. Edward II, by contrast, was softer in temperament and more drawn to companionship than conquest. He had an instinctive curiosity about the world, an interest in music, sports, and physical labor alongside commoners. This openness was unconventional for a king, whose life was expected to be dominated by the weight of duty, military campaigns, and political maneuvering. It made him relatable to some, but vulnerable to others. The pivotal relationship in Edward's life was with Piers Gaveston, a knight from Gascony who had served as a page to Edward's father. Gaveston was charming, handsome, and audacious, qualities that immediately captivated the young king. Their bond, described by chroniclers as extraordinary and consuming, transcended mere friendship. Edward elevated Gaveston to positions of power and influence, culminating in his appointment as the Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for royalty. This favoritism inflamed the English nobility, who saw Gaveston's rapid rise as both a personal insult and a threat to the established order. Gaveston's arrogance exacerbated the tension. He mocked noble rivals, flaunted wealth, and openly flouted courtly etiquette, enjoying the king's protection as his shield. Edward, blinded by loyalty and affection, ignored warnings from barons and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The court became a stage where private devotion collided with public responsibility. And the results were disastrous. Chroniclers noted the palpable resentment. The nobility viewed Gaveston as a corrupter of the realm, a manipulator who diverted the king from the duties of governance. Edward's indulgence in favoritism was not limited to Gaveston. Later, he extended similar privileges to Hugh Despenser the Younger, whose cunning and ruthless ambition further destabilized the kingdom. Edward's personal attachments became political liabilities. Lands were seized, rivals imprisoned or executed, and alliances fractured. The king's court, once a place of ceremony and governance, had become a theater of favoritism and intrigue, where affection was mistaken for strategy. The consequences of Edward's personal loyalties were severe and swift. The barons, united in outrage, exiled Gaveston twice, each time warning the king of the kingdom's vulnerability. Edward's defiance demonstrated that love and loyalty, though noble in sentiment, could be politically catastrophic. Gaveston's eventual capture and execution in 1312 was a direct result of this clash between personal attachment and the harsh realities of feudal power. Edward's grief was profound, but the political ramifications were irreversible. Enter Queen Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France, whose marriage to Edward was meant to solidify political alliances. Edward's deep attachment to male favorites left Isabella marginalized and humiliated. The queen, perceptive and politically astute, observed the court's dysfunction and the king's vulnerabilities. Her position evolved from passive consort to active agent. In 1325, Edward sent her to France on a diplomatic mission, a move she turned into an opportunity for agency. She refused to return until Edward's powerful favorite, Hugh Despenser, was removed. Isabella's response to Edward's favoritism was strategic, signaling the dangerous interplay of personal relationships and political authority. Her subsequent actions reshaped the English monarchy. She aligned with English exiles and her lover, Roger Mortimer, gathering an army that invaded England in 1326. The country quickly turned against Edward, who fled with Despenser, seeking refuge in Wales. Betrayed and abandoned by nobles and even clergy, Edward and Despenser were captured. Despenser's punishment was gruesome. His execution designed to satisfy both justice and public outrage. Edward, stripped of his crown, became a prisoner, a shadow of the king he had been, forced to confront the consequences of intertwining personal desire with public duty. The narrative of Edward II's fall is often dramatized through his attachment to Gaveston and Despenser, but it also reflects systemic vulnerabilities in medieval governance. The king's inability to balance affection with political necessity undermined institutional stability. His choices illustrate the dangers of unchecked favoritism in feudal hierarchies, where personal loyalty could override law, tradition, and counsel. Edward's story is not simply one of romance or scandal, it is a lesson in leadership, power dynamics, and the human cost of placing emotion above duty. Edward's death remains shrouded in mystery. Accounts suggest execution by a red-hot poker, strangulation, or deprivation, each version reflecting both the brutality of the time and the desire to control the narrative of a king who had failed politically and personally. Rumors of survival circulated for years, adding to the mythos of his reign. Whether he truly died in 1327 or survived in some form, Edward's legacy became a cautionary tale of how passion can imperil both throne and life. His story also intersects with broader questions about societal norms, gender, and power. Isabella, often vilified or romanticized, exemplifies the influence and agency of women in a patriarchal society. Her ability to marshal military force, navigate political alliances, and exact justice against those who wronged her reveals the often overlooked impact of royal consorts. In parallel, the treatment of Edward highlights the perils of emotional transparency in leadership. Kings were expected to embody rational authority. Deviation invited peril. Edward II's tale resonates because it humanizes monarchy. It reminds us that historical figures were not abstract rulers, but people driven by love, loyalty, grief, and ambition. His failures illuminate the delicate balance between personal desire and public responsibility, a balance that, when disrupted, can trigger far-reaching consequences. The story also underscores the fragility of medieval governance, where the king's personal life could dictate national stability. For modern audiences, Edward II's life is more than scandal. It is a mirror reflecting leadership challenges, emotional intelligence, and the politics of favoritism. From Gaveston to Despenser, from Isabella to Mortimer, the people surrounding the king demonstrate that influence can wield as much power as formal authority. Edward's narrative teaches that leaders are accountable not only for policy and strategy, but also for the relationships they cultivate and the biases they permit to shape their decisions. In sum, Edward II's reign is a multi-layered lesson. It is a chronicle of love and loss, of loyalty and betrayal, of political misjudgment and personal attachment. It reminds us that emotional choices, especially those made in positions of power, reverberate across society. And while history often judges Edward harshly, it also preserves the human story within the monarchy, a reminder that even kings are vulnerable to the forces of the heart, and that passion, when untethered from prudence, can topple empires. From a historical perspective, Edward II's experiences shaped subsequent English rule. His son, Edward III, inherited not only the crown but the cautionary legacy of a father undone by favoritism and personal indulgence. The monarchy learned to integrate emotion with strategy, to temper loyalty with institutional checks, and to recognize that love, while human, can destabilize kingdoms. Edward II, in life and legend, remains both a tragic figure and a source of insight into the delicate interplay between the personal and the political. His story also illustrates the enduring human themes of desire, loyalty, and the consequences of challenging societal norms. Edward's attachments disrupted expectations, triggered scandal, and altered the course of English history. Yet, within these upheavals lies a profound truth: history is shaped as much by human emotion as by strategy, and the consequences of favoritism, love, and loyalty extend far beyond the individual. Ultimately, the life of Edward II is a testament to the vulnerability of rulers, the influence of personal bonds on governance, and the enduring lessons of history. It teaches that leadership is as much about managing oneself as it is about managing others, and that passion, if unchecked, can be both a source of human richness and a catalyst for catastrophe. The tragic arc of Edward II endures as a vivid example of how love, loyalty, and ambition intersect to shape the fate of nations. If Edward II's story is a cautionary tale of passion gone awry, then Queen Ingeborg of Denmark's is its counterpoint, a study in resilience, moral authority, and the quiet power of endurance. Ingeborg's life demonstrates that strength is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it is found in patience, steadfastness, and the refusal to vanish even when the world conspires to erase you. Her narrative begins in 1193, when she married King Philip II of France, a union that promised political alliance, dynastic stability, and the continuation of medieval protocols. Yet, almost immediately, the marriage became a public scandal, revealing the tension between personal whim and political expectation. On her wedding night, Philip II, the shrewd and calculating monarch known as Augustus, reportedly refused to acknowledge his bride. Whether out of fear, superstition, political calculation, or personal preference, he claimed some grave impediment and sought to annul the marriage. For Ingeborg, a young princess thrust into the limelight of French politics, this was both personal humiliation and political jeopardy. Within a day, she was confined to a convent, her royal identity stripped from her, her future uncertain. The scenario reflects how women in the Middle Ages could be treated as pawns in political games, their bodies and choices subject to the whims of men in power. Yet Ingeborg's response to her predicament was extraordinary. Rather than despair or acquiesce, she exercised what historians call moral agency. From her convent, she wrote to her brother, King Canute V of Denmark, insisting on the legitimacy of her marriage. "I am his wife before God," she declared, framing her argument not in politics alone, but in spiritual and legal terms that commanded recognition. Her letters reveal a woman who understood both the legal and moral frameworks of her time, and who used them strategically to assert her rights. This combination of faith, intelligence, and courage allowed her voice to resonate across courts, eventually compelling the intervention of Pope Innocent III, a pontiff renowned for his assertiveness in worldly and ecclesiastical affairs. Ingeborg's persistence forced Philip II into reluctant compliance. Under the pressure of papal interdict, a potent tool that suspended religious ceremonies and endangered Philip's spiritual legitimacy, he dismissed his second wife, Agnes of Maurania, and restored Ingeborg to her official status. Yet even this legal victory did not translate into personal or emotional resolution. Philip treated Ingeborg with cold formality, avoiding intimacy and public acknowledgement of affection. For decades, Ingeborg remained technically queen, yet socially and politically marginalized. Her triumph lay not in public recognition or marital affection, but in survival and moral victory. Ingeborg's endurance reflects a broader theme in medieval history, the quiet power of women navigating systems designed to constrain them. Whereas male rulers exercised force and direct intervention, Ingeborg leveraged the instruments available to her: letters, appeals to the Pope, and legal argumentation. In doing so, she preserved her dignity, her identity, and her agency, all within a social structure that frequently sought to erase or silence women. Her resilience demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of power, knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to appeal to higher authority. This patience was not passive. Ingeborg's strategic use of correspondence, legal appeals, and moral argumentation allowed her to maintain visibility in the public and ecclesiastical consciousness. Chroniclers from Denmark to Italy documented her persistence, framing her as a model of piety, patience, and steadfastness. Unlike Philip II, whose public image oscillated between triumph and moral embarrassment, Ingeborg cultivated an enduring reputation for dignity and principle. Her approach contrasts with more overt political maneuvers, revealing that endurance itself can be a form of power. Her story also underscores the complex interaction between personal suffering and public impact. While Philip II consolidated power, expanded his territories, and achieved military success, he remained morally accountable to Ingeborg's presence. Her existence, letters, and appeals to Rome served as reminders of his misdeeds, subtly shaping political and spiritual outcomes. In a way, Ingeborg's influence was silent but omnipresent. She had no army, no banners, yet she commanded attention and forced correction through steadfast moral authority. Ingeborg's long life: she survived nearly 50 years beyond her initial confinement, was spent in quiet dignity, dedicated to prayer, charity, and maintaining her household. She was not only a figure of endurance but also of benevolence, supporting monasteries, aiding the poor, and engaging in religious observance. Her example challenged contemporary expectations. A woman could survive scandal, uphold her dignity, and exercise influence without resorting to public spectacle or violence. Her impact was as much symbolic as practical. She embodied the principle that moral and spiritual authority could exist independently of immediate political power. The interplay between Ingeborg and Philip II highlights the tension between personal desire, political expediency, and moral obligation in medieval monarchy. Philip, despite military victories and dynastic ambitions, was haunted by guilt, compelled to demonstrate public piety, and constrained by papal authority. Ingeborg, meanwhile, transformed personal suffering into enduring influence, showing that agency need not be aggressive to be effective. Her victory was not in domination or revenge but in survival and ethical consistency, a triumph that reshaped perceptions of female authority in a patriarchal context. Ingeborg's narrative also illuminates the role of the Church as a mediator in political and personal disputes. The papacy's intervention demonstrates the leverage that religious authority held over kings and states, capable of enforcing compliance and moral accountability. Yet the Church's power was exercised unevenly. The king's compliance was grudging, and the human consequences for Ingeborg were prolonged isolation and emotional neglect. Her success relied on understanding both the spiritual and political dimensions of power, navigating a complex system to achieve recognition without direct confrontation. Finally, Ingeborg's life offers lessons that transcend medieval Europe. It is a study in resilience, patience, and strategic endurance. She demonstrates that strength is often measured not in force but in persistence. That moral authority can rival political authority. And that dignity can outlast injustice. In a world designed to marginalize her, she maintained her identity and influence through intellect, faith, and unwavering resolve. Her life reminds us that survival, ethical consistency, and strategic patience can be as transformative as any battlefield victory or political coup. Her enduring legacy is visible in both historical records and cultural memory. Chroniclers praised her patience, moral rectitude, and strategic acumen, framing her as a model for future queens and noblewomen. Across Europe, her letters and actions became examples of how to navigate personal and political crises with dignity. Ingeborg's story demonstrates that the ability to endure injustice, while maintaining moral clarity, can create influence that outlasts immediate power struggles. In conclusion, Queen Ingeborg's life exemplifies the quiet triumph of endurance over aggression, moral authority over political machination, and patience over impulsive action. Her ability to survive scandal, maintain dignity, and navigate complex power structures provides a counterpoint to the tragedies of kings like Edward II. Ingeborg's story teaches that in a world dominated by violence, favoritism, and political gamesmanship, true power can reside in steadfastness, strategic patience, and moral consistency. Centuries later, she remains a figure of inspiration, a testament to resilience, and a symbol of the enduring strength of character in the face of systemic adversity. Her legacy continues to echo as a profound lesson in how survival, patience, and moral courage can shape history as effectively as armies or crowns ever could. As we draw our journey through the complexities, scandals, and innovations of the medieval world to a close, it is worth pausing to reflect on what these stories reveal about humanity. From the practical absurdities of moats, helmets, and candle guards, to the deeply human dramas of kings and queens navigating love, power, and duty, the Middle Ages were a world where survival often required creativity, courage, and sometimes sheer stubbornness. We have seen how human error inspired safety innovations, from the simple toilet lid to the strategic placement of guardrails and fireproof kitchens. These solutions remind us that progress often emerges from necessity, and that even small inventions can save lives in ways their creators never anticipated. At the same time, the stories of Edward II, Piers Gaveston, Hugh Despenser, and Queen Ingeborg highlight the timeless tension between personal desire and public responsibility. Leadership, whether in a castle or a kingdom, demands both wisdom and restraint. And failing to balance the two can have consequences that ripple through generations. In every tale, there is a lesson. Human curiosity, ambition, love, and folly have always shaped our world. The Middle Ages may seem distant, but the struggles, mistakes, and triumphs of those who lived then mirror challenges we still face today: navigating risk, managing relationships, asserting authority, and seeking justice. History teaches us that even in a world filled with dangers, both practical and political courage, ingenuity, and persistence leave a mark that outlives the chaos. So, thank you for joining me on this exploration of medieval life, with all its danger, drama, and ingenuity. Whether it was a moat that swallowed a knight, a plague doctor suit that accidentally saved lives, or a queen who endured decades of humiliation to claim her moral victory. These stories remind us that history is never just about dates and battles, it is about the human heart navigating a world that was often as unforgiving as it was fascinating. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the triumphs, disasters, and human stories of the Middle Ages, do not forget to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment sharing which story surprised you the most. Your thoughts help keep the conversation alive and the history vivid. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember, sometimes survival is a matter of ingenuity, and sometimes it is a matter of patience. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.